Okay, so we are recording and we are live on Facebook. I believe that's my cue to begin.
Okay. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our research roundtable online. On behalf of the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad, I welcome you. Monday noon is now for the research roundtable online. We're holding the meeting here on Zoom and live casting it on Facebook. Pranay will just share the link in chat. If you fall off the meeting here or want to share this talk with someone else, please use that link. We would like to ensure that all the interactions in this forum take place in a cordial, collegial, and harassment-free environment. This means that the space is welcoming and respectful to all interested participants, regardless of identity, location, and background. We expect you to follow the rules of engagement. Please turn off your microphones and stop your videos while the host and the speaker are talking. Please raise your hand or post your question in the chat section and wait for the host or moderator's instructions. Harassment of any kind and in any form, either verbal or non-verbal, in the chat or in the questions and responses will not be tolerated, including deliberate intimidation or disruption during or after the talk. Those who do not comply with normal standards of decency and respect may have their account disabled and their participation in the current or future forums blocked. If you notice anyone engaging in potentially disruptive behavior, please inform the administrator. His email ID is Pranay, that's PRANAY, @uohyd.ac.in. The next 1 hour is structured as follows: introducing the speaker, presentation by the speaker, short discussion inviting questions from the participants, Q&A open for all, moderated by the host, wrap up and closing. Please remember to note your questions as the speaker is presenting. Raise your hand when questions are invited and wait for the moderator's instructions for your turn to ask. Kindly turn your microphone and video on when it is your turn to ask questions. Or you could also post your name, affiliation, question in the chat if you would like the moderator to ask on your behalf. I hope everyone is on board. You could hear that. All was well? Yeah? Okay. So, today we have with us Dr. Aditya Deshbandhu. Oh. Sorry about that. It seems I'm not audible enough. All right. Is this better? Okay. All right. Okay. So today we have with us Dr. Aditya Deshbandhu, and he will be speaking on ethnography and the everyday, revisiting the classical to study the postmodern. He is an alumna of the department and currently teaches at the communication area at the Indian Institute of Management, Indore. He has been writing about gaming cultures in India since 2016 and has a regular column in Telangana Today, featuring the latest in the games universe. One of his earliest published works was Clear Perspectives, what it meant to be a gamer, which helps understand the gamer tag by charting and critically analyzing the gaming journeys of three video games players in an everyday context. I will be sharing the URL of these papers that I mentioned, these articles, and his Telangana Today column in the chat shortly. His PhD under the supervision of Professor at the department was a seminal contribution to gaming studies literature in India. Gaming Cultures in Everyday Life, published by Routledge, is coming out this year. Hello, Dr. Deshbandhu. Welcome to the first research roundtable online. How are you today?
As well as one can be, I guess, in these exceptional times, right? But
Yes.
thank you so much for considering me for this talk. How do I put it? I feel honored to be part of the research roundtable, and that I could be part of the first digital one makes it almost seem, very. Uh, it seems appropriate considering most of my work is with digital and all things online. So it had to happen, right? My research roundtable had to be digital. Okay, so I'm glad that I'm able to come back, and uh, it's sort of homecoming for me, I guess. So yeah, a little bit nervous, but quite excited. I hope that does the thing.
Yeah, I totally share your feelings because this is the first time that we're doing something like this online, and we hope it goes smoothly for everybody. I see that we have a few people complaining about audio problems. Is it better now, everybody? Could you please let us know via chat if it's better? All right, great. Thank you so much. So over to you. I think over the next 20, 25 minutes, we'll get to see what you have in store for us today. Over to you,
Yeah.
Aditya.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I'll begin the sharing of the presentation I had for today. Just a little bit of a backdrop. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today started off when I was there actually at the Hyderabad University in the Department of Communication. So just a little bit of a background. So I have a master's in communication from Department of Communication, and then I got lucky enough that the JRF happened very quickly, and a lot of things kind of aligned, and Professor Usha Raman was kind enough to take me as a doctoral candidate. And so when I kind of started off what I wanted to do, for the longest time, I was figuring out, what's worthy enough to study as a PhD topic, what's important enough, and a lot of that. So as I was considering most of that, I thought maybe games, considering I was an avid gamer for a very long time, would be somewhere I should begin my research. So for the purpose of the research roundtable today, I have tried significantly to take a lot of what we are doing, what I do with game studies, what I do, especially when I examine players playing video games, to something of a meta level and try and apply it to a certain degree to other digital leisure practices. Okay, so most importantly, I was looking at the methodological approach that I use the most, and ethnography is where I would kind of, park what I did. So I'm trying to examine that, and I'm trying to compare how ethnography, the way I did it, I used a very classical approach to it, in the physical sense, and how it stands up to say, I mean, the various advantages it had over, approaches like cyberethnography that Radhika Gajala does, or netnography that, has become increasingly prevalent today. So I'm trying to compare and contrast those things, and hoping to make a case as to why, maybe going back to the old school to study the cutting edge probably is not that bad, not that difficult, or probably is something that could offer us newer possibilities. Okay, so I'll quickly kind of outline the things. Uh, the first and foremost thing, I guess, is to understand what exactly is the problem. The problem here, I guess, I kind of was grappling with for a very long time, was to study players' engagement holistically. So when players play games, they're not just playing the game, they're not just clearing levels, they're not just defeating people and killing them across places, or not just picking up guns and shooting other people down, but they're engaging with those platforms. And games as digital artifacts, a lot of other work has been done on that, allow players to interact at a much more detailed and deeper level. So this is something I wanted to understand. How is it that games fit into people's lives? Okay, so the problem as I began to look at this thing was there was a lot of literature that was emerging around that time. This is early 2012, 2013, when game studies has become that melting pot of a lot of ideas. And the focus at that point, a lot of it was on games and the medium of games that it is. So there was a lot of work coming to us from psychology, behavioral sciences that were talking about games and violence. On the other side, you had things like, which are beginning to look at, games as digital artifacts. And also the time when one of the biggest debates in the field was happening, because it was such a new field, almost a subfield, if I could say so. The two big contestations were between ludology and narratology. Narratology was trying to claim video games as storytelling platforms, and just like there is a purpose in which why you play a game, and there's a narrative that holds the entire purpose of game together. So yeah, so narratology was claiming video games as extension to existing storytelling platforms, and that there was nothing new. There was this emerging tangent to kind of contest that, which was called ludology, which said that it cannot just be the narrative. No, it's not just the story. It's also the act of playing, the fun that goes with play. And that was the key problem. So it was in between that debate that the subfield was kind of caught when I began this point. And the more I kept thinking about it, and the more I think about it even now, I realized that there's nothing wrong if play is purposive, if there's a purpose to why you're playing. Even if you take one of the foremost ludologists, Gordon Kaleha's work, and his 6 points of analysis that he talks about. One of the trajectories in those 6 points is the purpose of the narrative. And for any player that's playing, it's very unlikely that they're consuming the ludic, that is the fun element, and the narrative differently. It's the ludic that spurs the narrative, and the narrative that spurs the ludic. They go hand in hand. So that's where I kind of began my first step, that it had to be ludonarratology. Okay. Now, how exactly do we then go about studying games, right? This is the key question. So I borrow from this person called Tom Burstoff, who is at the University of California, Irvine, who talks about 3 ways to probably look at games. First, examining the relationship between the gaming world and the gaming metaverse and the physical world in itself. Okay, so where is it that you're playing games from? How is it that you're connecting to those spaces? What do those games mean to you? Where, on what device are you playing? What console? Where does it kind of fit in the offline sense? So that's one trajectory. The second trajectory looks at the cultures of gaming. So games have gigantic universes, often called gaming metaverses, and within those universes, there are specific roles, there are specific designations, there are specific perspectives, and most importantly, specific practices that you kind of develop for the game you kind of play. So studying the various cultures that come in from within that. So that is the second trajectory. And the third trajectory is examining the gaming of cultures. How gaming then goes on to shape the physical world activities. How it shapes your offline now that you've played online. So if I were to borrow a line from my book, it would say, each time you enter the magic circle where where the act of gaming happens, you put in a little of yourself from the offline there, and you take a little bit of the magic from the online back with you. And it's from that continuous to and fro of taking the magic from the online back with you and getting the real or the offline with you back into the gaming world, that both worlds forever are changed. So that's where I kind of want to point it out. But the thing is, if you want to study players, you must do all 3 of them. It's impossible to do just one, and that's where the challenge is. So I think the fork and the right top corner is symbolic of a triple-pronged approach kind of thing. So yeah, moving on. So why ethnography? And this is the big question. So borrowing from Belstoff again, a lot of what happens in gaming worlds, a lot of the various challenges that we face when we're trying to chart them, when we're trying to examine them, and most importantly, holistically capture those experiences, is not very different from what anthropologists have faced when they're trying to understand new cultures and new civilizations, new societies, and all of that. So in terms of cross-cultural comparison, especially what is going through in a gaming world is not very different. So ethnography kind of fits in really well. And it also worked for me comfortably in my experience. It's because it's essential not to understand gaming not just as a leisure time activity, but an integral part of the everyday for players for whom it is their most important leisure time activity. Okay, how it fits into that rubric, how it becomes a part of their life, how practices are developed around it. Those become extremely interesting to explore. The second trajectory is to look at not what games do to people, but what people do to games. I'm borrowing from Coldry's media's practice approach here. So how people then begin to reconfigure these games with regards to how they want to do things. Lastly, understanding the various acts that the players perform, as part of a long-term strategy, as part of a plan to achieve ludic success, to become the kind of players they want to be in those game worlds, and how those kind of objectives factor. So most importantly, I guess the challenge here for us is to understand the various efforts they're putting in, the various ways in which they reconfigure game spaces, the reconfigure digital artifacts, but not to trivialize the effort. And that is something that is quite difficult to do. So moving on to the next dimension. So why not cyberethnography and ethnography? So if you look at cyberethnography as proposed by Gajala and Rivers, uh, they kind of call it an interactive methodology that focused on the epistemes of, or epistemologies of doing. Okay. However, if you look at cybernetic systems and if you look at games to begin with, they are completely ephemeral, environments. Games radically change over time, and with each update you get, with each software patch that comes in, the way one engages with the game completely changes. So players learn, players adapt, and most importantly, players change the way they're playing depending on the way the game works on a particular day. For example, if the internet is not great today, the game plays differently. So the game style required by the player is also different. So things like that are difficult to capture with something like cyberethnography. Now, moving on to netnography, as proposed to us by Kozinets and his iconic work. So Kozinets says, he calls it an observational research based in online fieldwork. And the focus of that lies in the fact that, it is computer mediated communication. So now my question to both cyberethnography and ethnography is, if the online is what we are explaining, the site or the field is in the online, how does then one chart or understand the offline component that enables the online, or the online when it changes the offline? Because the loop is continuously cyclical. A allows B and B allows A, and it's impossible to study one without the other. And their cyberethnography and ethnography come across as very limited in their scope. And one of our biggest challenges with them is that, I guess. Okay, so when the loop is higher, okay, and the loop is consistent, because if you were to take a gamer, what spurs you to start on the system that allows you to then play the game? And what happens after you switch off the game and you go back? Do you stop thinking about it? It's unlikely. And similarly, do you start thinking just at the moment when you hit the start button? Again, very unlikely. So it's paramount, I guess, and important to capture digital and online practices holistically. And that is where most of my work kind of stays. Uh, I don't know how many of you got the reference of the car at the right top corner. If you did, I guess there's a reason for it to be there. Okay, moving on. So why does classic ethnography work? Why do we have to return to the origin or return back to the basics? So again, interesting. Some of these points that I'm making, I'm borrowing from the work of Kozinets, because he's the one who is proposing for the cause of ethnography. And I'm using lines that and statements that he makes to argue for us to move back towards classical ethnography. So it's inherently flexible, ethnography as an approach, open-ended, and most importantly, the rich content that we get when you perform or when you use an ethnographic approach is unlike any. The second thing that makes it extremely interesting is the acuity of the researcher as an instrument. Of late, I mean, the last 2 decades, we have begun to see ethnographers acknowledge their reflexivity as a researcher, have begun to bring in the element that was tainting most earlier ethnographic work. So they have begun to accept the role of the researcher in the field itself. And the loop now seems more complete than ever. So ethnography seemed like a very, very viable tool for me to consider. The third fact is, it's an inherently assimilative practice. It has always intertwined with multiple other methods. And because of that, it allows us, so depending on the digital practice or the digital leisure activity or the digital act you want to analyze and study, ethnography can be reconfigured to suit that, can be reconfigured to adapt, can be reconfigured to accept what is it that is key. So for a medium practice and experience so ephemeral, be it the video game or most digital practices nowadays, we need an approach that is just as adaptable. And I find that in classical ethnography, in its ability to assimilate, it allows for us to ask those radical questions. So I would like to end with the point, right? I mean, I'm drawing from Lister's iconic, capturing the breaking wave. So we need specific ways to do it. And probably ethnography and going back to the origin is there because start it again. Now, moving on to virtual world ethnography. So, how do we make the case for doing it? Belstoff says we probably do something called participant observation. Now, this is extremely funny when you're trying to understand engagements of users and producers uh, in the um, virtual space or in the online space. Uh, the participant observation becomes what he envisages as an oxymoron. When you are a researcher studying these spaces, you never fully participate and you can never fully observe, because at the same time, you need to keep doing the two of them hand in hand. The question then is, why do it then? I mean, you're doing neither of the two properly, right? But a lot of people, Belstoff, Bonnie Nardi, T.L. Taylor, and I've also to some extent found it in my work, that there is incredible value, very rich nuggets of information in the blurring lines that exist between the researcher and the research. So when you are participating, but in the back of your mind, you know you're a researcher. And when you are researching, and in the back of your mind, you know you are a participant. You're unable to do each as well as you could have. In those compromises, you're getting infinitely rich data, which is amazing to kind of analyze when you go back to it. Okay, so participant observation in digital practices changes radically, and this is something I found both with my work with gaming and a little bit of my work now with binging, binge watching, and other uh, newer ways of observing streaming platforms. Lastly, uh, my work, I guess, is evidence that it is necessary to play and play well well if you want to make virtual world ethnography tick. If it has to work, you need to be able to play, or you need to be able to engage with whatever digital leisure activity you want to interrupt. Okay, so the gap between what people say they do and what people actually do is incredibly important now for us to examine. Okay, moving on now. I'm building on Belstoff's idea of participant observation for players to suggest something that I used, which was called co-playing. So co-playing as a method is such that you're playing with the person you're researching or with the participant in the study. So you're watching them engage with the online space. You're watching their decisions happen real time. You're watching them do this in their native settings, and you're doing it with them. So they do not think of you as a researcher studying them. Of course, it lies in the back of the mind. They also think of you as a fellow player. They're explaining to you the various strategies, the various decisions, and most importantly, the various split-second actions that they're performing. A lot of these things cannot be captured on the screen. So while it is possible to see what act an avatar is making on screen, it is not possible to understand what buttons are being mashed at that time, what clicks are going in, and most importantly, how is the decision arriving at in that split second. So classical ethnography with something like co-playing allows us to do this. You're in their native space. You're seeing the infrastructure that they're handling. You're seeing the establishment of the human-computer interface. And then you're seeing how actively they engage with all of this. So now co-playing, I found in my work, requires 3 or 4 necessary things to kind of consider. First thing you need to do is you need to establish your credibility. A lot of times, gamers that you seek to study, players whose experience you want to chart, might not consider you to be, comfortable enough with the medium or aware enough of what is it that they're going through in their digital worlds or their gaming metaverses. So it's essential to establish credibility. And if you take the kind of work that I do, where I do not study a specific game, I rather study the gamut of their playing practices. It's essentially important for me to play the game that they're playing, master it, and then establish my credibility and tell them, hey, I understand what you're going through. I'm at the same level with you, or maybe a little lower. I would like to play with you and see what is it that you're going through. So that is one of the biggest challenges, I guess. Now, the second thing is when this happens and you're playing, you have put in severe amount of effort as a researcher, and you are living both those lives. You are a gamer now and a player, and you are also a researcher trying to chart their ludic practices and their actions and decisions. So how do you stop thinking, or how do you not become the player in a sense? When you're playing with somebody at such a high level to establish your credibility, you are extremely tempted to only focus on the play. The challenge then is to pull yourself back and make yourself remember and think that, yes, I'm a researcher first. So I need to capture this data. So that was one of the biggest challenges I went through, and something I envisage is going to be very difficult for us if we employ something like co-playing. The third thing, I think this is a little more practical. So when you watch video, it's likely that there's going to be extremely high gaming volume or extremely high volume from other digital leisure practices. So audio recordings can at times not be able to capture what the other person is saying, and it's very difficult. So field notes then become very difficult. Become paramountly important. You have to take field notes. Now, how do you take field notes when you're playing along with somebody? How do you manage that? And that's the challenge. So I used to use pauses between play cycles. So you go into a quick match, you play a match, the match ends, you ask them for a minute or two and quickly jot down notes. And then you go back in again. And then it's not going to be one participant. It's not going to be one game. And the same participant is unlikely to play the same game over a longer period of time. So you need to keep re-establishing credibility. Active engagement with the artifacts you are analyzing is extremely important. It's severe hard work and it takes a lot of time and dedication. So that's the challenge. How do you kind of do that? Okay. And if all of this is not difficult enough, or if all of this is not something enough to grapple with, the question is, we are persevering towards a holistic capturing of the experience, right? To chart everything that we can. So will co-playing be enough? So my argument is, I'm borrowing a little from the transmedia work that's emerging, and a lot of the transmedia work that Henry Jenkins and all have kind of done. When narratives are layered, practices of people, engaging with those narratives and those artifacts might be layered too. And that's extremely important for us. So moving on, I guess this is kind of like the final thing to wrap things up. Digital practices are seldom standard. They always change. They're constantly evolving and reconfigured. Even if we take the basic act of navigating hypertext when one reads online, it has changed significantly in the last 10 years. We have seen changes happen with tabs. We have seen changes happen with floating tabs, multiple tabs, and a lot of that. So it's very likely that online environments also change continuously. Even the very act of how we watch streaming platforms has changed. So Amazon Prime, for instance, has changed so much in the last 2-3 years that one has, worked with them. So things like that. Now, point number two, participants or producers, they modify their engagement as well. And it's important for us to understand how is it that that modification is happening, and how is it that that practice then changes their everyday, changes their offline and all of that. So with each change, imagine it kind of like snowballing. And each snowball kind of changes everything else. So the challenge then is to kind of capture all of that. Point number three, there's a lot of, there are a lot of examples about anthropologists and ethnographers who come from the West who to try and study Indian cultures and, specific Indian groups and all of that, and how they learn the language. So with virtual world ethnography or digital ethnography or, ethnography, when you're trying to understand digital artifacts, it's extremely important that one goes in prepared as well. If you're studying video games, you understand how a game works, yes, but you also play the game. You have reached a particular level there. You're trying to understand binge watching platforms or, streaming platforms. Yes, you should have watched enough. You should have understood that enough, because the skill gap is evident otherwise. What is it that the participant is going through is extremely important for you to have, reached to a certain level to understand what is it they're telling. All the rich data is not of much value if you're not the right conduit to hold and understand what is coming through. So that, I think, the onus on us is significantly higher now. The fourth point, what I was asking from the last slide, I guess, will co-playing be enough? Do not only want to capture what is it that they're doing in the online space or what happens before and after. You also want to capture the reflections. You want to capture the contextual information that comes in. The other dimensions of the everyday, that enable or inhibit these things. What is it that happens? You want to capture all of that as well. And then probably you might realize something along with co-playing might work in tandem. And the good thing is ethnography is as assimilative as it gets, right? So I guess that allows us to do that. Again, interview guidelines. If this point comes across because I have used in-depth interviews along with co-playing and a diary system to kind of capture the data I was looking at. Interview guidelines also can no longer be uniform because no two players are going to play the same set of games. They're not going to play the same games in the same way again. And no two games are ever the same. If all of these are not enough, games change as well. So interview guidelines also have to consistently keep changing. So like with my study, I had 14 participants whom I had interviewed 7 times. So towards the end of the study, for the final round at times, I had 14 different interview guidelines for all 14 of them. And developing them is extremely challenging because you want to make sure that you factor in each of their experiences as well. Lastly, how things stand from what I can see right now is an approach like this is better suited for longitudinal research designs where you have time for it, where you're willing to, put in 18 months, 2 years, or maybe higher to understand how a player evolves, how their skill changes, how the game changes, how the world changes, and how does their understanding of the offline change in consumption. So all the three things that Bellstock was asking about, how do those things change? Correct. So longitudinal research designs kind of work, but I also see increasingly interesting avenues to explore cross-sectional designs as well. Participant pools where you get in different kinds of experiences to see how things work. So I'm seeing a lot of promise there as well. But I would like to leave things with this thing. The challenge is not just to capture the magic, because a lot of times with these things we are stuck in trying to capture the magic. But it's important to capture the mess and chaos as well. And I think that's incredibly important for us to consider. So I would like to end the presentation with this. Thank you so much. And thanks for listening to me for the last 25 minutes, I guess. We move on towards the discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Aditya. That was quite the opening presentation for Research on Digital Online.
Thank you, I guess. Yeah.
Right. So I think, oh yeah, we already have participants raising their hands. I would request everyone the following, say 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes we have for question and answers. I would request you to please raise your hands, and as we announce your name, please turn on your microphone and your video and ask your question away to Dr. Deshbandhu. Could we have Sunita Reddy, please?
I'm unmuting.
Thank you so much. I'm Sunita Reddy. I've been a student of Hyderabad Central University Anthropology Department, now teaching in JNU for last 16 years. I really appreciate, Aditya, your passion for digital world and your gaming, which you combined for your PhD, and it was wonderful listening to you, because I can relate very well being an anthropologist and my son into playing video games. And as an anthropologist, I always get very interested in understanding ethnographies and how well you used ethnography to understand digital world. And it's very interesting to know how 16 or 17 of your interviews, and for everyone you had to really build a new interview schedule. I just want to ask you a question as to how did you convince these respondents about your research? One, you of course said while you play with them, you try to understand the whole gaming process. But for your in-depth interviews, convince and the methods you use, tools you used for ethnography. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Quite detailed the question. So I'll begin step by step. So one of the things was we used a snowball or sponsorship technique to kind of begin with. I needed gamers of a particular kind, or rather players of a particular kind of experience to kind of understand. So if you look at the bigger project, the project was to try and arrive at a meta understanding of gaming culture in India. So in order to do that, I needed players with as many diverse play experiences as possible, playing on as many platforms as possible, playing with for a significant amount of time, engaged in different kinds of games, genres, and all of that. So I wanted it to be as messy as it could be. So I started off with 5 participants who became part of my initial pilot, and each of those participants served as a source point for the snowball to kind of roll out. So I had 5 parallel snowballs that kind of opened up, and with each of them, I convinced them. I tried to explain them, and this often required me establishing my credibility as a player. I used to play with them. The first co-playing session was often looked at by them to understand if I was good enough. A lot of them were very skeptical. So I remember somebody whom I was interviewing who told me right away, if you're trying to point out that gaming causes or enables violent behavior, then I'm sorry, I cannot be part of this study. So there is a lot of how to put it. There is a lot of skepticism. There's a lot of how to put it. Uh, there's a lot of hesitation when people want to talk about gaming, because let's be honest, most of the fabric in India still kind of understands it as a trivial pursuit, um, which is not very important to a lot of people. So it was extremely challenging. I had participants drop off because they were not doing very well academically, who were their parents telling me, he's using he's using the excuse of being a part of your study to overgame and not study, and a lot of that. So I had a lot of those challenges. So very, very difficult, madam. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Now, speaking with regards to the various tools I used, co-playing was one. The way I kind of designed it and developed it, the way I played with them and got them to open up. So the first 2 sessions, so I had 7 sessions with each participants, 14 into 7, that's about 98 sessions. The first 2 sessions were, a little, how to put it, a little demure, a little laid back, not laid back rather, a little hesitant from both sides. But once they realized that what I was doing, by the 3rd or 4th session, they kind of warmed up. So by the 5th session, those interviews and as well as the co-playing sessions were acts of incredible amounts of data and buzz with activity. So you want to capture all of that, and that's what it takes. So I guess the trust building part here is significant, and that's where I guess also what I was saying, longitudinal design kind of helps, because you're going back to them, you're going back to the field. I mean, you're going back to their places of native play. You're seeing the infrastructure. You're accustoming yourself to it. So I remember, towards the end, with one of the interviewees, the last time we went, his mother made us biryani so that we could all sit together and eat. And it was such a touching gesture that she went through so much effort, and extremely grateful, I guess. So does that help, ma'am? Does that answer what you were looking for?
I'm sorry, I think there are network issues. So can we please go to the next question? Mr. Divyaditi Roy, please.
Hi, Aditya. Am I audible to you?
Yes, boss. Audible. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll try to not be partial because you're my colleague. I was part of the recruitment panel that got you here at IIM Indore. So one, I find your work incredibly interesting and relevant, because not only do you think of a new method, you also apply it to absolutely new texts in the Indian gaming context. So the question I have for you might be as a self-reflexive question too. So when you talk of virtual world ethnography, one important point, and I know we've mentioned this before, is the act of playing well. And you mentioned that. The act of playing well as an act of sort of establishing credibility. Now, when you come to game studies research, you want methodologies that include. So isn't the act of playing well a privilege in a country that has 40% of the population without internet access? And secondly, does it not also exclude researchers who come to this act of gaming as an amateur? Because that's where I came from, right? So if you could talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so both, I guess, dimensions of that question are amazingly well put. The first one, yes, gaming, I think I've been talking about this a little bit of late. gaming as an act, both as a leisure act, an act of leisure, and as well as something you want to examine, comes from a position of incredible privilege as to how things stand. So when I say, yes, you need to play and you need to play well, it worked in my unique case, I guess, because I've been playing video games for a very long time. And yes, it takes a lot of, capacities to adapt to various games that are being played and all of that. But yes, what I'm suggesting is one way to probably study games as digital artifacts, and not the only way. There are other ways in which games are being studied as well. There are close readings of games as texts. On the other side, analysis of ludic experiences, using the various engagements that one encounters in games to try and understand other phenomena, and a lot of that is happening. And yes, you are right. I am privileging the fact that a researcher who kind of plays well is likely to do a research of this kind better. That is true. But if we look at it from the other side as well, if there are researchers who begin to study artifacts which they actively engage with, it is all the more necessary for them to chart the subtle nuances and the difficulties much better than somebody else would. I'm not saying that somebody who enters video games, examining video game studies, or enters video game studies as an amateur is at a disadvantage. They can ask questions that we take for granted. For the longest time, the questions of access was something I had incredible difficulty to comprehend, because I never seem to have had those problems when I was a player initially, before I kind of took up the study. But now more and more, when I look at it from a meta level, from a distant level, I appreciate what you are trying to ask. And you're right, there are significant problems here in a country where a lot of people still do not play actively, or by the numbers are internet access to smart devices, access to devices you can play. These are still not as democratic as they can be. So I would like to say, yes, there is a lot more to where this can go, but I guess we should still accept the possibilities of what is available on offer. Would that answer the question you're looking for, Diba?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Aditya. I think we'll take the rest of the discussion offline. Thank you.
Of course. My pleasure, boss. Thank you.
Okay, could we have Professor Usha Raman and then Anjali Lal Gupta ji please to come in after this?
Okay, I thought Kalyani Suresh was next in your list, but that's okay. I'll go ahead and ask my question. Can you hear me, Aditya?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So I just wanted you to kind of step back a little bit, and this is more for the benefit of everybody else. When talking about, this whole, you talked about that messy space of insider, outsider, right? And if you remember, we went through several cycles of what we called autoethnographic writing to sort of exorcise yourself of this insider perspective. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, because I think for a lot of people who are studying contexts that they are very familiar with, this process of rendering the familiar unfamiliar, so that you can look at it, afresh. I think that's particularly problematic. So how did you, as somebody who was immersed in gaming, then make this transition to being a researcher?
Extremely valid question. I guess I struggled with this, and I still continue to struggle with this significantly. So if you look at the 2-3 sides of me, there's me as a player first, who has been doing that for a very long time, and who continues, who I think will continue to keep doing it for a while as well. Then there's me as the person, as Devina introduced, right? The person who writes for Telangana Today, who is supposed to have an industry oversight of what's happening in gaming and the video game industry, and is supposed to give an expert opinion on those things. And then there's me, the researcher, who needs to look at all of these things reflexively, is supposed to examine them critically, and not let the magic tint everything, especially the lens that you have made for yourself to examine these things. So my biggest problem is, I guess, also, I guess, with a lot of other people who want to examine activities that they're deeply engrossed or immersed with, is not to be over celebratory. And Professor Usha will kind of, remember the fact that my first 2-3 drafts of what I had initially written had to be severely panned because they were extremely celebratory. They were, there was huge sentences of hyperbole and all of that, which is the norm if you're a player, right? Which is the norm if you're somebody who's trying to understand the industry. But for an academic, for a scholar, it's all the more necessary to see what you're examining and how it kind of it factors into a broader societal kind of sense, how it becomes applicable to as much as it can. So one of the biggest challenges for my presentation today as well, yes, while my work is with games and game studies, how is it beneficial to students who are pursuing a doctoral degree at the University of Hyderabad Department of Communication? And not all of them might be, people working with digital spaces, people working with leisure time activities. So what is it that you can provide a bit for everyone? So everybody who is kind of trying to read your research, what is it that they can take away from? How do you provide that broader meta understanding? Correct. So my biggest challenge was that. And I still struggle with it a lot, especially when I get deeper with specific games and other studies or research or other research projects I kind of take. So distancing helps. Distancing helps a lot. And I guess at times you have to be, how do I put it? You have to keep asking yourself, yeah, so what's new about it? You need to keep asking yourself that. So why does it matter? Why does it matter? Be a little, condescending to yourself so that you come back better, you frame your arguments better. You see how is it that everybody kind of, not everybody maybe, but how is it that most people will glean something out of this? Because the more specific you go and the more detailed you go, there is value. But then getting all of that back and connecting to the larger body of work, to the discipline you kind of come from, that is also a significant challenge. So I hope that answers what you were looking for.
Okay, do we have Kalyani Suresh back online?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Aditya. It was a very, very informative and, though I don't play games, I do teach, online and digital narratives. So it was quite an eye-opener for me. I would like to ask you, because this is out of curiosity more than anything else. I've heard one of my students talk about, games such as World of Warcraft, where the gamers have to release a virus that kills off the competition. But one day there was a glitch and the virus ended up spreading and killing everyone. And this sort of caught not only the attention of researchers but even virologists all over the world. And recently, I believe there is a game very similar to COVID-19. You know how gamers are able to go beyond the dangers of virus. And so do you think this ludo narrative that you were talking about does not, of course it is on a digital space, but do you think it goes beyond disciplines, transcends disciplines and discourses? And don't you think that becomes even more difficult for a researcher, because it's not just anthropology, it's going beyond that? So where do you think researchers can come in, especially researchers who are not gamers, but are really interested in studying ludonarratives in such cases?
Absolutely, ma'am. What you're telling is right. So such is the nature of it, I guess, right? Game studies as a subfield as well. It is a melting point of as many perspectives as possible. So one of our biggest challenges, I guess, how to put it simply, one of our biggest challenges in game studies is defining a game, because we have still not found a way to do it. Okay, because there is no concrete definition that encompasses everything that can be a game. So it's the same thing with studying ludonarratives or ludonarratological pursuits. Anybody who can bring in a different set of perspectives to understand how these artifacts function, to how people can engage with these artifacts, and how much more can we unshackle the potential of these kind of artifacts is welcome. So while what you're beginning to talk about, games that kind of model what's happening with COVID-19 and all of that. So I have one of my recent studies, I think I'll present it in a conference in July, kind of talks about this, how games, because of the incredible level of modeling and simulation they can do, because they're inherently computer-centric systems, right? So the various complex calculations and permutations that they can do, they allow us to rethink a lot of things, to question a lot of things, to even look at possible trajectories in which events or discrete events could have played out. So, for example, in that particular study, I kind of talked about how, you could use games to radically question events that are possibly, in the not so distant future, like the impact of global warming, for example. There's a game called Detroit Becoming Human, which talks about how the entire world's coastlines have submerged, and how cities like Detroit and have become increasingly important because they are the new places to kind of live in because they're not on the coast and things like that. So a lot of potential comes to us from these platforms, and the way I look at it is we unshackle things. Games, depending on what they can offer, are not going to be very different from what people like the writings of Isaac Asimov used to offer to us. Correct. So I guess that could happen. So that potential is important, and that's why it's all the more important not to seal off the discipline's entry points, to welcome as many people as possible, to liberate it from that ludological or narratological pursuit, to allow as many people to engage, interrogate the artifact and the nature of the artifact as much as it can, to see how much can actually kind of crop up, because that allows us to then understand the various ways in which things can, be used, engaged. The gamut becomes more colorful, I guess. And I would be happy with that kind of a vivid, vibrant schema of things. Does that answer your question, ma'am?
Okay, I think we've lost Kalyani ma'am again. Since we're running out of time, could we please have Anjali ma'am with her question?
Yeah, hi, Aditya. Can you all listen to me? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes,
yeah,
please go ahead.
So thanks, Aditya, for that very informative and insightful presentation. My question is a very basic one. I was wondering if, when you say online spaces, now there are so many different kinds of online spaces, right? There are now online classes that are being held, in a big way, and then there is also something like online dating. So when you mention co-playing as an important aspect of this kind of research, what kind of ethical considerations do you encounter then? And what kind of ramifications you have with the people you're trying to study? I feel in some spaces, autoethnography would be more ethical than somebody from outside coming in. And, there are all kinds of ethical considerations here. What do you have to say about that?
Absolutely, ma'am. A very valid question that you're asking. So ethical concerns were huge when I was kind of thinking of my study as well. One of the reasons that all the participants in my study were over the age of 18. Okay, for those of them who were living with their parents, I had gone ahead and still I also got parental consent, because I would be visiting their play spaces at their homes, and homes provided by parents, right? Infrastructure provided by parents. So I used to, that's one of the biggest concerns when you're in such spaces, to get the ethical consent, because you are invading their native workspace, their native play space. For some of them, it's the safest place that they belong in. Correct? It's their safest place. You're invading that. So it takes a lot of time, and I had extremely difficult times trying to convince a lot of people who could have been, possible or potential participants in the study, about how I would protect their privacy, I would protect their identity, I would protect them in any which way I could. But yeah, it is a hit or a miss thing. A lot of them I wasn't able to convince. I had significant difficulties. I don't know if Pranay remembers, of girl gamers who used to play games at home, but the people at their home didn't know that they used to, because they used to play on their brother's devices, and they didn't want them to know. So a lot of these challenges you encounter. while I understand the potential from autoethnography is huge, but the fact then also remains is that autoethnography at times becomes very, very, how to put it, unidimensional. Correct. In ideal settings, if you would like to say. So, I mean, if I were to take an autoethnography of myself, you must also understand that there are certain benefits I enjoy being in a city like Hyderabad, with the kind of connectivity that Hyderabad receives. Also being part of the gaming community the way in which I am. So now, while all of this allows, yes, for an ideal setup to conduct probably what would have been an empirical study, I would like to capture as much flavor as possible, the various challenges that people encounter. So, like, I had participants who moved cities because the internet connectivity was not there, and the kind of challenge that goes with them moving those cities. Now, shouldn't a study like this also capture something like that? And yeah, well, our autoethnography could do it, but all those discrete events, one person's lifetime may not happen. So, I would like to kind of use this as a possible way of answering the question you posed. I hope that's okay.
Okay, so I'm going to take the opportunity of segueing into a very good question that sort of connects to the existing discussion by one of our alumni, Nukuraju, who's teaching at Central University of Kashmir. And content, social networks and relations, location data, browsing data, data about likes and preferences, etc. This online activity is fun and work at the same time. It is a labor guised in playing. Play labor or playber creates a data commodity that is sold to advertising clients as a commodity. Would it be wrong to think this way? And what's your take on this? And then he has another question, which is about trying and revalidating research in case of ephemeral topics like this. So if you could club these questions together and answer them together, please, for Nukuraju.
Thanks, Professor Nukraju. Both the questions are fantastic. The first one, play labor, is becoming increasingly important for us to examine, because if you look at it, one of the core tenets of understanding a game has been the element of fun that goes with it. Okay, so now when you kind of take both the elements or dimensions into consideration, the first being, yes, video games are also at the end of the day, media artifacts, or just like any other media product, they are dual nature. If I were to borrow from Robert Pickard, so while on one side, yes, they use games as a platform to get as many people to play those games as possible. On the other side, they would also like to sell those participants, those players, if possible, and sell them to advertisers, sell them to specific people who sell targeted equipment, people who make, anything and everything, from Mountain Dew's G Fuel to those specific gaming chairs, to specific advertising from, gaming keyboards to cooling pads and all of that. So on one side, all of that happens. Now the second side also, which I have begun to increasingly explore, I have something upcoming with Professor Usha and Dr. Kasturi's edited work with Orient Black Swan that's coming up, where I ask this question: as increasingly people begin to look at streaming platforms to stream their social and gaming activities, look at ways to monetize these things, what exactly happens to fun then? When fun becomes a means of monetization, okay, what happens to labor? What are the new definitions in which this labor kind of fits? And what happens when a 15-year-old has to file, a tax return when they're streaming content on platforms like Twitch? The radical social systems that are being challenged and are being changed in these kind of norms. And that's why labor becomes one of the most important things for us to examine. Correct? So, fantastic question. I believe if you would like to further your exploration in this area, Tom Apperley from Australia also looks at labor and the labor element. Also the fact that if you look at beta testing of games, right? So when players test upcoming games, and Then the developers use the various findings from those beta tests to improve those games and then sell them back to the same players who helped them find those problems in the first place. So the gaming community has a very consistent to and fro there. So that's the one point. Now the second question that you were asking, Professor Mikiraju, the validity angle. So it's very, very difficult, I would guess, with something, if you take a qualitative analysis like this, especially with ephemeral platforms and products, to even think of validity. Correct. So even if you were to conduct two parallelly identical studies with two different sets of participants, correct, it's very unlikely that you would get similar data. While you might get common trends that would intersect, you would get common themes that could stand and help understand the culture on a meta level and deeper level. It's unlikely that validity is something. Not validity, maybe replicability or replicability is something that we would like to do. So we try and establish validity from putting in as much rigor as we can, getting in as much richer data as we can, using the snowballs to find people who experience the same kind of ludic narratives and platforms. So like in my study, what I did is, if you look at people who play World of Warcraft, you have 2 or 3 people in the study who play World of Warcraft. Then you take their points of view from all 2 or 3 of them. You see the level of semblance that kind of comes from their perspectives and interviews and the way they play. And then you understand. But then again, the fact is, what if the 3 of them do not play the same position in World of Warcraft? Because they're team-based games. And people play different roles, so their perspectives to the game are different. And then the game changes in itself. So it is in that constant cycle of contestation, between the player, the developer, the researcher, the site, that we kind of exist and try and arrive at an understanding. So while a lot of us might be belabored or scared or find it extremely excruciating at times, it is important for us to do this work because it is necessary to keep an archive of these environments because these are extensions of the self today, and B, also to understand how the play of today was shaped by the experiences of yesterday. So I hope this answers the question that you both sides of the questions you're looking at.
Yes, so what we are doing now is taking a few questions from Facebook Live, and I can club these together. We have Malika Rao Vijay Kumar, Zahir, and Vibhuti Sinchala, who I believe have questions regards to methods. So I think it would be a good idea, Aditya, if you could mention a few key books or key authors, because they're asking questions like, are digital ethnography and virtual ethnography one and the same? Can we have a mapping of origins of cyberethnography, and how is it different from digital ethnography or cultural analytics in digital humanities? And another question that has come out is about biases in this kind of methods. So if you could take all of these together.
Could you just repeat the last one, the final question?
The final question was by Zahir and Vibhuti, and they were asking if these research methods can become biased. How can we remain unbiased while doing this sort of research?
Okay, so I guess being unbiased is one of qualitative research's biggest challenges, right? But in the fact that, I would argue that being unbiased is a bias in itself. Okay, so please do not consider this as a, how do I put it, a rudimentary or a reductive way of doing away with the argument. I appreciate the need for objective distance when you do this kind of research. To not let your personal experiences paint or color the data and analysis that you're working with. But I would not, how would I say, I would not burden the researcher who's carrying out work of this kind to have to deal with the notions of what it means to be unbiased. Okay, so that is something I think we could distance ourselves from. Now, there's a certain value and ethos in which qualitative research is carried out, and I think it's extremely important for us to protect that. Protect the rubric in which that kind of functions. Now, moving on to the second side. For cyberethnography, if I were to begin, one of the greatest places to start would be with Gajala and Ribas's article on cyberethnography. That would be a good place to start. Somebody else to kind of look at would be Kantsman, who also kind of talks about that. If you look at ethnography, there's a lot of, Kozietz is a great place to start. And after that, a lot of other people have now begun to look at ethnography. There's a lot of work coming to us from China, for example, that looks at ethnography, very rich data in the way things are being done. Now, the third thing, I guess, digital ethnography and virtual world ethnography. The two are different. In digital ethnography, you're still interrogating digital platforms and digital media and digital practices. Virtual world ethnography, on the other hand, then moves on to things like specific worlds that are created online in online spaces or computer mediated spaces, and you're interrogating those worlds within. So your ethnography is not just limited to the users of those platforms. You're also, the ethnography extends, right? You're also studying the virtual world with them. You're traversing it with them. One of the best examples for this is, Bonnie Nardi's work when she talks about her night as a rogue night elf, and how she stands and appreciates all of those spaces. Similarly, there is work which talks about, enjoying the sunset, the digitally rendered sunset in World of Warcraft. Okay, and things like that. So you need to chart both. You need to chart the players, how they're playing, their practices, how they go online, offline, all that. And you also need to chart what is it that they're experiencing, what is it that they're engaging in those spaces. So that's where I guess the need to play with them also helps. It helps significantly. Correct. So you're beginning to see how it happens and all of that. So now coming back to this. So that's where I guess the digital ethnography and virtual world ethnography are different. So great places to start for virtual world ethnography is the work of Bell Stock, which I've cited in my presentation. You can take a look at it. He's at University of California, Irvine. He's a professor of anthropology, and he has some really good work. Other people you could look at are Bonnie Nardi, T.L. Taylor for virtual world ethnography. They have a book together called the Virtual World Ethnography Handbook, which you could take a look at. Now, moving on, if you're interested to try and understand it in Indian context, I believe there is a book called Digital Cultures in India. I have written it. If you would like to take the time out to take a look at it, that would be great as well. But moving on from that, digital ethnography, especially with artifacts and platforms, I think the kind of work that Sherry Turkle is doing, Alone Together, for example, or the kind of work that Dana Boyd is doing with things like Always On and all of those are extremely interesting to look at. From a more critical kind of view, you could look at the work of, say, somebody like Alexander Galloway. Again, very, very important questions being asked by him. Somebody like Tarleton Gillespie, if you would like to look at the infrastructure in which these platforms function. So you must understand, we are all trying to understand slices of things that are available to us. Okay. Now, each of them are very, 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 very narrow slices. So it would be extremely problematic of me to say that this is probably the only way to do it. There are going to be many ways to do it, and we need to celebrate all of them. Now, the bigger project for them is to find out all of these slices and the information that comes to us from these slices, and then stitch them all together. That's the challenge, to stitch them all together and get the big, grand picture. So with quant, we are beginning to see that. Big data is promising to do that. It's giving us stories behind numbers we cannot imagine. And all of that's happened. But with qual, the project is going to be much, much longer. The project is going to be much, much more rigorous. The project is going to be much, much more difficult because, we are qualitative researchers. We have to make it difficult for ourselves. So all of that will happen. So I guess this would be a great place to start. Look up the names I've told. I think it should help. If there's anything else, feel free to write to me. It's not at all a problem. I'll be happy to help any way I can.
Thank you so much, Aditya, and thank you also for mentioning your book. In case you guys want to pre-order his upcoming book, Gaming Cultures in India, Digital Play in Everyday Life, I've just shared the link with everyone in chat. Thank you so much for taking time out, Aditya, for doing this talk, and thank you everyone for participating. I'm so sorry that we did not have time enough for more questions. I hope you also join us next Monday at noon for a session by Professor Usha Raman, which is about deconstructing the data gaze. I think that's a pretty interesting session, and It's derived out of her research fellowship at the University of Bremen. So we'll get to hear a little bit about that experience as well. Thank you so much, everybody. I think that's our time. We went 15 minutes overboard. Sorry so much. Sorry about that. Yes, thank you, Aditya.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to listen to me. It was a pleasure coming back home. Thank you.